Necromunda, one of the largest hive worlds in the entire Imperium, and, to hear some tell it, the greatest hive world as well. Though one might then ask the question, what precisely constitutes greatness when one is comparing kilometers-tall mountains of metal and ferrocrete, teeming with the unending disparate masses of humanity, everything from the greatest, most pampered of the highest spire-born lords to the lowliest, swamp rat-worshipping mutant of the deep drainage swamps far below. Perhaps one judges a hive world by its population. A reasonable argument, certainly, and one that would certainly favour Necromunda, or Arenas Prime, by the way, if you're the scholarly sort, as it boasts a population of well in excess of 100 billion souls. Or, at the very least, that was the number the Manufactorum drones arrived at the last time there was a census, before simply just giving up and tacking a plus onto the end of the number. It's also worth mentioning that the kind of Manufactorum employee tasked with carrying out official censuses have probably never even been below the middling layers of your average hive city, and if they were to venture forth into the urban jungle in such an occasion, they would be escorted quite heavily. I would actually, in fact, imagine that the military-grade combat servitors toddling along in their wake would ensure that for every +1 added into their great tomes of knowledge, a -1 might be subtracted as well, due to overly irritable and sensitive combat wetware. And so the 100 billion plus is a guess, a best estimate, an educated supposition, and little more. There are likely to be a lot more people than that deep down in the cavernous maze-like underhives. So measuring a hive world's greatness in population seems like an inexact science. What about industrial capacity then? Necromunda arms trillions of Imperial guardsmen all throughout the galaxy. It churns out literal oceans of lasguns. Fleets of bulk transports take off from hundreds of landing pads and make dozens of trips up into orbit each and every day to feed the insatiable hunger of the huge suckling transports that lay in constant orbit above the planet. The moment one's immeasurable appetite has finally been filled, it slips out of the orbital dockyards immediately to be replaced by yet another one. And lasguns are not the only produce to flow in an unending tide from the non-stop production of Necromunda's vast forges. Autoguns and shotguns are also produced and shipped off to PDF and enforcement troops throughout the galaxy. But the most prestigious, the most glorious of all of Necromunda's countless manufactured goods is the Hammer of Angels, the weapon of the God Emperor's avenging sons, the Adeptus Astartes bolt gun. A weapon manufactured to extraordinary high standards. Only the most skillful and meticulous of forge masters could ever produce them, and only the most loyal of worlds would ever be allowed to use their forges in their massed production. Perhaps it is, then, this accolade that finally clinches Necromunda's claim to greatness? Or could it be something else entirely? Could it be the planet's most voluminous resource, one in absolute, desperate demand throughout the Imperium, more so than guns and tanks and even titans? For all these things, powerful though they may be, are worthless without good, violent men to use them. Actually, Scratch the good part. For whilst the countless numbers of the Necromundan Guard are well known for their ferocity and determination, they are equally well known for being a rather unruly lot. But hey, nothing that a few extra dozen commissars can't handle, eh? And what is a little bit of post-execution paperwork in trade for quality manpower? Fine fighting men are the foundation of any army throughout history, and truly good soldiers are not merely born, they are forged. And what better place could there possibly be to see the raw resources of humanity tempered into warriors than the near-total wars of the Underhive? Violence is not a choice down there. It is the one and only viable survival strategy. You have to battle toxic fumes just getting out of bed in the morning, then a few mutants and twisted wildlife to continue to draw breath and maybe even get something to eat. Possibly the wildlife or the mutants. A task made considerably easier if you have a few friends along for the hunt. The overwhelming majority, like 99% of civilians down in the Underhives, join one of the hundreds of petty gangs scattered across the subterranean steel caves. These gangs in turn clash constantly with other petty gangs, along with various cults of the emperor-worshipping or otherwise variety, with scavengers, with raiders, with the out-hive ash wasters, which occasionally make forays into the underhives to secure a little bit of booty, and, of course, with the mutants, who have often also learned about the many benefits of organization. There's also the occasional rad-spawned monster, but those things are often best avoided. Some of them grow to the size of skyscrapers, feeding on the various non-too beneficial radiation, all too plentiful in the Underhive. And of course, whilst they are engaged in the busy, brutal and violent course of making a living, they all hope and pray that their activities will not be noticed by one of the big gangs, the Orlocks, the Deliquays or Goliaths, because if they do, odds are they'll decide that they want everything the little gang has. If they're feeling particularly merciful, they might even give them the option to join or die. Harsh, but fair. At least so long as you believe in the innate justice of blind, brutal violence. And why wouldn't you? If you're born a Necromunda, it's the only justice you've ever known. Even before the Imperium came to the world. Humanity was, of course, scattered across the stars during the golden age of technology. And due to its relative proximity to the solar system, Necromunda was in all due likelihood colonized quite early on in mankind's infestation of the stars. And whilst some planets may have been settled for their beauty, for their innate hospitality to human life, Necromunda was settled for one simple reason. It was rich. It had a wealth of geological resources, enough to feed several towering hive cities erected across the surface of the planet, all equipped with substantial infrastructure and forge complexes, to furnish the human federation, then in its infancy, with all the manufactured goods its growth would require. I have no doubt Necromunda saw brisk growth and profits during that period. But then, of course, as we all know, the Elder had their little whoopsie, spawning a chaos god into existence and plunging the entire galaxy into darkness, with inter-system travel brought to an almost complete grinding halt. And where it was still on occasion possible, it was fraught with danger, and could only be carried out sparingly. But Necromunda, or Arenas Prime, as it was officially known at that point in time, was an exception to this rule, as it was in possession of a series of mysterious ancient warp gates. No one knew who had placed them there. They certainly weren't human tech. In fact, many were even questioning whether they were technological at all, or some form of natural artifact, perhaps. Regardless of their origin, these warp gates allowed Arenas Prime to establish a small empire, known as the Arenas Continuity, as they were able to maintain communication and trade lanes with a series of other planets. This continuity was ruled over by an upper class of tech nobility, which held the worlds in an iron grip, with absolute control and a military created from cyborgs. Vicious, murderous, half-human, half-machine warriors, which I have no doubt the Mechanicus took a profound interest in when they discovered them. Though, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. The Arenas Continuity continued to exist without the Imperium's knowledge, and vice versa, for quite a long time, despite being a mere hop, skip, and a jump away from Terra, due to coincidence, divine interference, who knows what. It was not discovered until, by accident, it was discovered by a patrol of Imperial Navy warships. They had encountered a warp squall which had hit their Geller fields and threatened to overwhelm them. Forced to carry out an emergency translation, the patrol was dumped into real space, as it so happened, just within the periphery of the Arenas Continuity's borders. The ruling tech nobility immediately took steps to welcome the interlopers. They were probably quite scared and confused, in all due honesty, as it is entirely possible that due to the warp gates, they had no real knowledge of warp travel in the more traditional form of the Imperium. They may have viewed this as the sudden appearance of alien intruders upon their system, the first in perhaps their entire history, maybe. They dispatched their own warships immediately to intercept the Imperials, and this confrontation ended in a series of boarding actions when the cyborg military overwhelmed the Imperial warships, capturing or slaughtering the crew, but not before an astro-telepathic SOS was dispatched, informing the rest of the Imperium not only to the location of the Arenas Continuity, but to the fact that they were apparently hostile as well. The tech nobility had placed their collective cocks in a lawnmower just by revealing their identity to the Imperium. And then they'd gone and primed the engine too by attacking the warships. The role of the lawnmower would henceforth be played by Hashin Yonad, commander of the 39th Household of Inuit, the Imperial Fists Legion. 20,000 fists, alongside millions of Imperial Army troops and Mechanicus elements as well, launched a full-scale invasion of the Arenas Continuity. The tech nobility swiftly responded in the only way they could, by shitting the bed, pissing themselves in fear, and then dying at a rate that would leave mayflies deeply disturbed and unnerved as to the longevity of their existence. It took the Imperial Fists less than 2 months to crush the entire little empire of the tech nobility. They must have felt quite high and mighty, there where they sat, the lords of multiple entire worlds, functioning trade lanes and interstellar travel. Clearly, their story had only just begun. I am sure many a fevered brain in the upper echelons of Arenas Prime society dreamt of the day they would expand beyond the limits imposed upon them by the warp gates. And then strangers came, unknown people with odd, peculiar technology that might promise that very thing. After all, they must have gotten there somehow, right? Clearly they knew something that the tech-nobility did not. At least, they knew it until they seized their ships. I wonder if they took any of the threats levied against them by the crew seriously. One during an interrogation, say, to figure out the nature of the warp drive. A naval rating, a captain, an officer, or a tech adept may have spat out, "Oh, just you wait until the Imperium gets here." If they didn't take those threats seriously, I'm sure they took them very seriously when the 20,000 yellow-armored invincible bastards with fully automatic rocket launchers showed up at their doorsteps. Though, was a hint too late then, wasn't it? Having realized that they had pulled the pants down of a much, much larger and more violent Imperium, the tech-nobility of Necromunda looked up into the sky to see it darkened with the Imperial Fist warships and thought to themselves, surrender is the honorable option here. And so they did. Necromunda was taken without any further casualties. Or Arianus Prime, excuse me. But then, the events that would cause it to change name occurred. After the Imperial Fist had taken control over Arianus Prime, mysterious aliens, described as living lightning, began pouring forth from the warp gates. It was made swiftly clear that this was no average enemy, as they inflicted heavy casualties upon the Imperial Fist and the Navy elements. Hashin Yonad organized the remnants of his forces and began falling back to Arianus Prime, realizing that he had no hope of defending the entirety of the arena's continuity, leaving the other systems to their grisly fates. Once the unknown aliens arrived in Arenas Prime as well, the remaining Imperial Fist, along with the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy forces, made a final stand, buying enough time for massive nuclear charges to be detonated across the warp gateway. Once it collapsed, the aliens, Xenos, monsters, demons, whatever they were, simply disappeared without a trace. But the Fists had been extremely hesitant to destroy the warp gates. They were clearly ancient and incredibly powerful pieces of technology, which, if they could have been replicated, would have given the Imperium an immense strategic advantage in further wars. But as it became clear that the invader could not be defeated by conventional means by the forces at his disposal, he ordered their destruction. He had already suffered thousands of Imperial Fists dead. The Imperial Army elements had suffered far more heavily, and most devastated of all was Arenas Prime. The planet had been virtually covered in towering hive cities, in fortified metropolises and towns. The population was so vast, no accurate census data existed. But after the destruction of the warp gates, 90% of the planet had not only been scoured clean of life, but had been made completely uninhabitable. Only a handful of hive cities had been able to withstand the battering living lightning barrage of the invaders and continued to cling to life. With the casualties stretching into the hundreds of billions, The planet was thusly named Necromunda. You might think that a planet with such a bloody past would have had enough of the sanguine liquid. You would most assuredly be incorrect in that, however, as the next 10,000 years of Necromunda's history was just as vigorously violent, just on a slightly smaller scale, as the Imperium immediately put the planet to work. After all, in conquering the arena's continuity, they had lost 6 sectors worth of habitable, productive worlds. Wasn't really Necromunda's fault, but you know how the Imperium can be on the details on these occasions, and they fully expected the remaining Hive cities to make up the shortfall. Unfortunately, most of the planet's industrial capacity was already located within the armored Hive cities. The outside had mostly been used for comfortable living area for the populace. And luckily, now that the planet's entire focus was on simple production, comfort was no longer required. Happy coincidence, that. Those lucky few who, few, quote unquote, few again is also a relative term, those lucky few billions who found themselves within the Hive towers survived the apocalypse and were swiftly recruited into the new labor programs instituted by the new planetary governors. Necromunda would have its responsibilities and oversight divided between several governing families, which would each take command over various Hive cities and Hive clusters. On most worlds, a single Hive would almost certainly be the capital settlement of that planet. On larger Hive worlds, you may have anywhere between 4 to a dozen or so Hive cities scattered across the entirety of the world. But Necromunda, over-blessed as it is with these towering structures, possesses entire organizational systems of several hives of varying size organized in under the same general umbrella. The largest on Necromunda is the Palatine cluster, consisting of the main hive, Primus, and then Temenos, Acropolis, and Thrasior as the next largest hives, and with a further 4 or 5 smaller hive cities surrounding them as well. These then, of course, also exchange materiel, processed goods, and resources between one another. One's forgers may specialize in the production of Titan-level weaponry, another the humble lasgun, another again the peculiar reflection mechanisms that allow the lasguns to function, and so on and so on. To actually move all of these things from one hive to the other, they are all connected via colossal maglev lines, which operate behemoth engines capable of transporting entire armored regiments at a time, along with all of their personnel, ammunition, replacement parts, anything and everything they need to be loaded onto mass transports and dispatched straight from the surface of Necromunda to fight the Emperor's wars. Unfortunately, the machines that run up and down the maglevs, though possessed of near unmatched transportation capacity, are all supremely complex, requiring both specialized personnel and extensive maintenance to keep operational. This limits their realistic operational radius to inter-cluster transportation. When something needs to be moved from one place to another across the planet, for example, a trip from the Palatine cluster to Vosroth, practically on the other side of the globe, then enormous highways are used. These are vast, wide areas of permacrete paved roadways, Compared to the maglevs, they are much, much, much slower, and their transport capacity is also far more limited. But a good old-fashioned truck is a simple instrument. It can cross the continent-length distances with a fair degree of reliability. And whilst it is certainly slow, it's a lot quicker than trying to cross the broken ash wastes. And on that note as well, the areas outside of the hive cities and the clusters are uninhabitable. Or they should be. They absolutely should be. Nothing grows out in the ash wastes, and water is practically a myth. At the very least, water that isn't more industrial pollution and acid than it is good old-fashioned H2O. And yet, the primary threat to the trucks and the maglevs when they have to run above ground between the hive cities is humans. We are a remarkable species, aren't we? We will find a way to survive in even the most hostile of environments, so long as we have other humans to take shit from. These raiders are a mixed bag. Some are outcasts, criminals, wanted men so thoroughly infamous and loathed within the hive cities that existence within them is a practical impossibility, where they can't even draw breath in between all of the bounty hunters aiming for the sweet, sweet payoff placed upon their heads. Such individuals might find no other way to continue to exist than going outside into the great ash wastes and prey upon those who live out there. Other groups are tribal bands, virtual savages, perhaps the descendants of outcasts, or those who have existed within the ash wastes for centuries now in one way or another. There are also those out there who have no other choice, not necessarily because they are outcasts, but because they are hostile to the very idea of human life. We'll get to that a little bit later, but Necromunda has had its fair share of extraterrestrial occupants, shall we say. And some, of course, might even come from established gangs or even noble clans within the hives who see it as a lucrative opportunity, raiding maglev transports or the huge mass conveyor trucks moving back and forth between the hives. After all, strike the right one, and you might nab yourself hundreds of thousands of freshly made weapons. Now there is one hell of a bounty, though of course such a bounty would undoubtedly be heavily guarded as well, both by enforcers, the law enforcement, perhaps even Arbites personnel, and maybe even PDF and guard forces too. Now that is a daunting prospect, but the possibility of getting one's hands on 100,000 las rifles, that is quite the motivation. Especially when you take into consideration just how difficult life can be within the hives. Now there's another possibility as well. There might just be those who decided to head out into the wastes because life in the hives were just that shit. Remember, Necromunda has been a mining and producing world for tens of thousands of years. Its natural resources has long since been fully exhausted, to the point that literally entire mountain ranges have been ground down and shipped off as gravel. Those that still remain are in the process of being exploited exploited. The very ground itself has been dug up and redug up and re-redug up so many times that whatever was at the bottom has seen the light of day a dozen times over. One of Necromunda's leading industries right now, in fact, is recycling the past. Literally taking the refuse of previous generations, steel structures, infrastructure lines, old maglev tunnels and transportation systems, breaking them down, reprocessing them, and creating new pieces of infrastructure or produce to be shipped off-world from them. Of course, that also includes biological goods as well. After the planet's surface was scoured and made uninhabitable, Necromunda's ability to sustain a population of a certain size plummeted drastically. Necromunda maintains some food production in agroponic farms, but it is nothing more than the meagerest of drops into a vast, unending ocean of hungry mouths. And starvation is yet another excellent motivating factor for a bit of innovation. Necromunda has come to the point where its citizens' bodily refuse, their literal shit, piss, blood, and meat, are all reclaimed whenever possible, and then reintroduced into the cycle of life as food. Of a sort, anyways. And yes, sure, that might sound repugnant, disgusting even, absolutely, but without it, Necromunda would starve near instantly. Even if we ignore the often difficult to extract nutritional value of someone's literal shit, the gathering of corpses and recycling into so-called corpse starch that's a name that doesn't leave a whole lot to the imagination, is it? Is the business of the Corpse Guild, also known as the Mercator Pallidus. This is one of the largest, most influential, and most important guilds on Necromunda, for the, again, very simple reason that without them, not only would the planet starve virtually overnight, but millions of people die in Necromunda every single solitary day. Could you imagine the kind of disease that would spread? Millions of rotting corpses everywhere if there wasn't an extensive system to gather them and reclaim them constantly. Starvation would swiftly be it would be a problem with a natural solution, shall we say, as people would start dying far more rapidly of sickness than of lack of food. But the population cannot be nourished entirely off their brothers, sisters, uncles, and other relatives, because, as it turns out, eating other human beings have often unfortunate side effects. Luckily, the Mercator Pallidus, utilizing their long and proud expertise, have managed to remove most of the negative side effects, yet, nevertheless, raising entire planetary populations on just dead people. Again, unfortunate side effects. And so Necromunda imports billions of tons of foodstuff on a near daily basis. The produce of entire agri-worlds, whole planets virtually covered in wheat, in grain, in grox pastures, etc., are devoured by the hungry mouths of hive cities over the course of months, in some cases weeks. The Imperium not only hungers for resources, it also needs a never-ending flow of food. And oh boy, just for a second, think of the logistics required for this. Let's take a nice low number, right? Let's say that we are dealing with one of the small hive cities in the Palatine cluster. A humble hive city of perhaps a billion souls, yes? Let's also say that they don't need to be the best fed people in the galaxy either. They only need enough food to keep them kinda healthy and kinda productive. After all, so 1,200 grams per person per day. Let's also further say that they can make up half of that number through recycling the dead. An optimistic figure, definitely, but let's roll with it. In that case, this one hive city would require a little bit north of 660,000 tons of food every day. Just bringing it down from orbit would be a tremendous undertaking. Then you have to transport it throughout the hive. And bearing in mind too, if there's a delay, if the grain shipment is a day off, then catastrophe strikes. And in all due likelihood, you'll have widespread riots and general uprising across the hive. So you want to store some of this too. At the very least a month or so of foodstuffs, or at least a few weeks on starvation rations just to make sure. So you need to transport hundreds of thousands of tons of food, then you need to store millions of tons of food, and then on top of that you also need to distribute this to all of the various citizens. Wow. Small wonder that food riots are so common in hive cities. That is a logistical nightmare right there. Though it is made at least a little bit easier by the devolved system of control that we find on Necromunda. In fact, this is fairly common on most major hive worlds and within major hive cities, where the governor, the top boss in charge, delegates responsibilities for various portions of the hive cities running to smaller groups, individual clans, long-standing noble families, or, in the case of Necromunda, occasionally, the gangs themselves. They get the responsibility for overseeing food distribution, for example, or running particular factories or forges, meeting deliveries, ensuring that the flow and import of goods continues as expected, so on and so on and so on. In the case of Necromunda as well, there is an element of survival of the fittest. Those who are unable to carry out the responsibilities and the duties imposed upon them are usually replaced rather swiftly by younger, more energetic upstart clans rising up from the bottom to replace the old chaff, leading to a surprisingly dynamic upper crust of nobility, though still crushed under the weight of the near absolute control of the top dogs, the handful of supreme families across Necromunda that have held complete power and sway over their cities for generations upon generations upon generations. The greatest example, of course, being Gerontius Hellmore, the current planetary governor of Necromunda. His position at the very top is so thoroughly secured that everyone simply refers to his house as the Imperial House, as his overweight arse is the closest you're likely to get to the God Emperor's grace on that blighted world. Interestingly, of course, this is also a little bit of a microcosmos of the underhives. As we touched upon previously, the smaller gangs compete with one another, hoping to not draw attention from the larger gangs. who are themselves in turn often little more than vessels for the noble families, tools to be used for their internal politicking. They might hire groups of gangers to inflict unfortunate accidents upon their competitors' preferred business ventures, perhaps even use them for all-out assaults or assassination ploys. And obviously, the power in between the gangs too wax and wane continuously. One day, Delique is untouchable, whereas the Orlocks are at their lowest ebb. 5 years into the future, House Delique might very well be on the very edge of obliteration, whilst the Orlocks reign supreme. And then there's all of the thousands upon thousands of little gangs within these gangs, and gangs within the gangs, and gangs within the gangs. A rather fascinating feudal system. Almost a little bit of a microcosmos of the Imperium, in fact. As the rationale is much the same. The Imperium is not a centrally governed authoritarian state, for the simple reason that it can't be. There is no way to govern the Imperium from a single seat, just as there is no way to govern Necromunda from a single seat. This obviously also in turn means that the planetary governor is practically God. I wasn't joking when I said he was about as close as you'll get to the God Emperor on Necromunda. His influence is absolute, and he is treated like a semi-deity, really, within the political power structures of the Hive. The slightest hint that he might be committing to an action is enough to send entire lesser houses into a desperate scramble to garner his approval, or avoid his wrath. As the Adeptus Terra and the wider Imperium don't give two shits about how he runs Necromunda, so long as he meets his tithes. And he makes damn sure that he meets those by disposing of anyone who seems likely to fail. In fact, the only power structure within Necromunda over which even Helmaur has no command is, of course, the Imperial Fists, ensconced within their secret fortress. Though that is of course not to say that the planetary governor is entirely free of responsibilities. It's just that his bosses are so much larger that the concerns of a single planet is just not of interest to them. The only way their eyes could be drawn to Necromunda was, well, a missed tithe would certainly draw some attention, but even that is a minor annoyance. So long as the next one makes up for it, that isn't the worst thing ever. More importantly, Necromunda needs to maintain stability. It is a vital manufacturing world, after all. And stability is a broad term when it comes to Hive cities. Helmaur is responsible to ensure that all of the hives keep themselves in line, that nobody gets any ideas about secession, independence, or some such nonsense. It might seem mildly crazy that an individual hive city might try to secede, but it has happened in the past. Being the lord over 1 trillion quadric tons of steel, metal, and weapons can tend to give people a rather inflated sense of self, after all. But more realistic dangers might be mutants. Now, some mutants are unavoidable in a population that large, and most are simply cast out from society to die in the swamps or form little bands here and there. Minor annoyances, really. Psyker mutants, on the other hand, larger annoyance, much larger annoyance, to be hunted down and exterminated immediately. There was also the incident with Hive Secundus. I did mention extraterrestrials previously, didn't I? Hive Secundus was, as the name suggests, once the second largest hive on the entire planet. In fact, its production capabilities and population was set to potentially eclipse that of Hive Primus. It was upsetting the power structure of Necromunda quite considerably. You can bet your happy little buttocks that Hellmauer was not overly happy about that either. But as long as it did not threaten the position of the Palatine cluster directly, there was little Hellmauer could do to stop the rise of Hive Secundus's influence. Then an Inquisitor arrived. Weird rumors had been spreading about Hive Secundus for quite some time now. Their production capabilities increased exponentially, faster than anyone could really truly explain. Same with their population too, it was booming, and yet they were consuming relatively little food. Something very weird was going on. Now, most of the Imperium, Hellmauer himself probably, ignored the problem, seeing this as nothing more than an unlooked-for boon, a gift from above. But the Inquisition thought otherwise. And for once, they were absolutely correct. It turns out, you see, that a rogue Adeptus Mechanicus Biologis had snuck himself aboard one of the countless transport ships heading to and from Necromunda every day. Upon arriving within Hive Secundus, he had resumed his highly heretical experiments. He had apparently gotten his hands on several samples of gene stealer DNA, which he figured might be an interesting little experiment. Once the reality of the situation was revealed to the planetary governor, Hive Primus immediately launched an all-out nuclear attack upon Hive Secundus. The entire planet's weapon grid lit up and bombarded the Hive into near obliteration. Such was the force and ferocity of the bombardment that the topmost section of the Hive city was shorn from the structure and sent toppling to the ground below to be crushed underneath its own weight. For hours, the attack continued until nothing could ever possibly live anymore within the shattered, irradiated husk of Hive Secundus. Furthermore, the area around the city was reduced to an absolute nuclear wasteland. The area and the Hive declared off-limits to all Imperial citizenry and personnel. Hive Secundus would remain as a faintly green, glowing reminder to the rest of the population what the cost of subversion would be. Unfortunately, gene stealers proved to be remarkably resistant to nuclear fallout. And even now, the gene stealer cults of the Scions of the Needle continue to rebuild their numbers, their strength, and their influence within the shattered ruins of Hive Secundus, with all of Necromunda remaining blissfully ignorant of the threat. And hey, if nothing else, Necromunda certainly does prove that yes, on occasion, ignorance is bliss. Ignorance of what the gang next door is cooking up in terms of plans for your property. Ignorance of the gene stealer cults. Ignorance of the Arbites' next raid to head into the Underhive. Ignorance of the new crop of psychically active mutants about to blast a hole in the entirety of Hive Primus, ignorance of the billions of small and large inconveniences that make up day-to-day life on Necromunda. But hopefully your ignorance of the great Hive world has been somewhat lessened today. There are still topics to be discussed, like all of the various guilds found on Necromunda, and of course, the gangs. I did mention some of them in passing: the Delaquays, the Orlocks, the Goliaths, the Escher. Oh, there are a lot, and they have their own backstories and lore as well. But like the gangs, I think these are better served by their own videos. So for now, until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.